friends, I'm Nadine Brandes, the author of Fox, Romanov, and the Out of Time series, and this is just a quick intro because the video that I'm bringing you today is my drafting process as an author. I was inspired over on Instagram by Adrienne Young sharing her drafting process. If you're not familiar with Adrienne, she is the author of Sky in the Deep, one of my favorite reads of 2019. So I have been working on new projects, as you know, and I thought, what other opportunity am I going to have to get to share my drafting process from the beginning of a project all the way through the end, through all of the editing? So I filmed a little vlog about my drafting process, and I did this over on Instagram. The video is probably going to be a little bit smaller, but at least you will have all of the same information that I shared over on Instagram. Here is my first video, which is all about how I set up to draft a book, where my ideas come from, and kind of how I get started in the writing process. I figured it can help, if it can help you at all as a writer to see some of my process and either think, hey, that's how I do it too, and that's okay, or think, oh, that's not how I do it, and that's okay. I find it very inspiring and encouraging to see the process of other authors, because it reminds me that everybody's process is different and that there's no one right way to write a book, but it also inspires me in different ways to try new things. So without further ado, here's my video. Hi friends, welcome to my drafting process. So a lot of you have asked how I draft my books, and currently I'm starting a new project. I'm actually working on several projects, but one of them is just from scratch. There are hardly any words down on it, so I thought I would share my drafting process as I go through writing this manuscript. So this is my writing desk. I don't always write here. In fact, I rarely write here. I don't have a set writing space. Sometimes I write in bed or at the table in the kitchen, at a coffee shop. I used to write at a coffee shop all the time before I had Halfling. On the couch. So basically I'll write kind of wherever I feel like writing that day, but I do like having a set writing desk where I don't do work on this desk. All I do is write. So when I am doing work things, I have a different desk. It's actually right behind me. You can see my computer there. That's where I do things like emails and marketing and all of the business sides of writing, but this is my creative space. So I wanted to share a bit just kind of how I set it up or how I prep to begin writing. I have a notebook that says write on it for every single project that I work on. Back behind me you can see kind of their tan and black ones. Some of them are empty, some of them are filled with other book information, but I always have a physical notebook where I keep all of my outlines and my notes, and basically anything that is in my head for working on my current project goes into this notebook, and I give myself permission for it to be messy. It doesn't have to be organized. Sometimes I start doing character profiles and then I interrupt that with descriptions or a scene or trying to like bullet point a chapter, and it's nice knowing that it can be messy but everything's still going to be in this book. So this is like what comes with me everywhere. I also have like little trinkets and things on my desk. I always try to write with a scent attached to every book, so that when I am getting into the writing mood or mode, when I'm sitting down to write, that scent can get me right into the zone. And so some books I have a candle, others I have like a lotion, but basically I have different scents that when I sit down it makes me think of that book or that project or just writing in general. I'm a big believer in trying to use all of the senses to get myself into the writing zone. So candles are one of them. Windows are another. I like to sit next to a window because weather is very inspirational to me. I notice if I don't sit next to a window, then instead, when I'm at a spot in my writing where I need to think about a scene and I look up from the paper or from the computer, usually if I'm not by a window, then I tend to turn to my phone or social media. It's just there as this distraction. But if I'm sitting next to a window, when I look up, I see nature, I see descriptions, I see life, which is where I get so much of my inspiration from. I almost always have tea with me. I'm not much of a snacker when I write. I will only ever have tea, and if I feel like eating something, it will be tea and shortbread. I also put together a Spotify playlist for every different project. And I take a long time putting these together over the course of a year. Basically, once I get the idea for a book in my head, I will start a playlist, and then over the months and years, whenever I hear a song that I feel fits that story, I add it to that playlist, so that then when it's time for me to sit down and start writing that book and drafting that book, I have a playlist already ready. And as I write, if there are songs that I feel don't fit, I'll take them out. But for the most part, I usually have a decent playlist of like 20 or so songs, a mixture of soundtracks and songs with words set up for when it's time to write. So, ideation. A lot of you asked, how do I come up with my ideas? And my ideas tend to start with the what if question. So with A Time to Die, my first book, the question was, what if you knew the day that you were going to die? How would that change how you live? And a whole story blossomed from that question, where it's an entire world where everybody knows when they're going to die and how that completely changes their way of life. Same with Fox and Romanov. You know, what if I did a retelling of the Gunpowder Plot, but instead we're following Guy Fawkes' son? Okay, how do I know which story to write? I got this question from a lot of you. I feel like I'm actually kind of odd in this sense that I don't have tons and tons of ideas in my head. I, right now, probably have 3 or 4 stories that I think are developed enough to actually be books in the future. I don't get hit with tons of story ideas. I get kind of 1 or 2 at a time over a long period of time. But when I am faced with multiple ideas, like I am right now, because I'm not under contract and I'm not on deadline, so I'm able to pick whichever story I feel like writing, I write whichever story I'm most excited about. I know that there's a lot of doubt on, well, what if it's not good enough? What if it's not an original idea? What if this isn't sellable? And I try to set aside those doubts as much as I can and just write the story for myself. Because if I let those questions determine whether or not I'm going to write, it is going to hinder my entire writing process, because everything I write is now going to be for somebody else or trying to live up to some sort of standard that I've created in my mind. Whereas if I'm just writing it for me, it gives me the freedom to let it be messy. It gives me the freedom to change things and fix things, and kind of lets that story come out however I want it to come out. And then in the editing process is when I think about, can this story be salvaged? Can it be tightened? So that's kind of how I pick the story that I'm ready to write. As for when I know a story is ready to be written, usually I'm sitting on a story idea for 1 to 2 years, sometimes more. I have one that I came up with 15 years ago that I still have not written, and it's not quite ready to be written. I'm still developing a lot of the plot. I am not a character first novelist. So a lot of you asked, what comes to you first, characters or plot? And typically I will try to develop the plot after I have the what if question. I try to see if there's even a plot that can go with that idea and with that story. Once I feel like there's a solid enough plot, that's when I feel like I can begin writing, because I don't really do character development until my first round of edits. So my first drafts come out, as Adrienne Young says about her drafts, my drafts also come out very lean. So I fill in a lot during the editing process. So my first draft is usually focused on getting the plot right. And I still have an idea of my characters and I've developed them as much as I can, but I really don't tighten them or get their arcs down until I go back through the book and work back through the story a second time after the first draft is done. I don't know if I answered that question really. Being 7 months pregnant, I feel like my focus of thought is not as clear as it once was. But I'm doing the best I can. So how do I prep a new story? So this is my new story. I've been going back and forth on what I can tell you about it, but kind of the placeholder for a name that I have right now is Wishtress. And it's a young adult fantasy standalone. I don't think that'll probably be the title if it goes on to get published. Maybe it will, who knows? But that's the term that I will be using for it right now, so that I at least have something to reference. But this story, I had the idea about 3 years ago. It was one of those rare ideas where when I first got the thought, then it just took off like in a matter of weeks, where everything was falling into place as I followed this what if question, and this whole plot just developed, and I was so excited to write it. And I took notes in my notebook, and now I'm finally sitting down to write it because I feel like it's ready, and hopefully I'll be able to finish it before baby comes. But I do not outline. So a lot of you asked, how do you outline? Show me how you outline. I don't outline. I actually tried outlining this book and it just didn't work for me. It's never worked for me. I feel like when I outline, I'm putting myself in a box. I'm giving myself these parameters, and I don't like being in this structured space. I've always liked the idea of structure, but I have tried outlining with all of my books and it never works. It actually makes it a lot harder for me to write. This is also why I don't stick to writing formulas like the 3-act structure and things like that. It actually makes me less creative, and I feel like it boxes in the story too much, that then I don't have the creative freedom to take the story where I feel like it's telling me it needs to go. So the most that I will do that might look like an outline is a bullet point of what needs to happen in the story. Usually this is just because I know all these things need to happen and I don't want to forget them, and so I'll just do some bullet points on a single page. And then as I write the book and I get to spots where I'm not sure what's going to happen next, then I will do another bullet pointed list, and it's kind of like brainstorming that turns into a list, which I guess you could call an outline, but it's not an outline. It's just like, write these things, Nadine, because they have to be in your story. So outlining has never worked for me. My first entire series, the Out of Time series, was written completely by the seat of my pants. Fox and Romanov, I did plan out things in my head. I make sure that I know the beginning and the end of the story, and then things that I know want to happen somewhere in between. And as long as I have the beginning and end, I'm able to weave the story in a somewhat structured manner. And I just keep that in my head because I feel like once I write it on paper, it takes away the fun of creating. And for some reason, my brain thinks like, well, if I'm writing it down, I might as well just be writing the story instead of writing an outline. So I don't outline. I've tried lots of different ways of outlining and it's never worked for me. But I do kind of keep notes on what I know needs to fit into the story. So hopefully that helps some of you who have trouble outlining, but this is my 7th book that I'm writing, and I've used kind of a different method and tried new things with every single book that I've ever written. So I would say just keep trying lots of different things, different outlines that maybe look like it works the way your brain works, or if you just know that you're not an outliner, that's okay. So I admire the people who can outline. I've always wished I could be that organized, but it's just not how my brain works. One more question about like setting up for drafting that I got a lot was, when do I research and how much do I research before I start writing? And Fox and Romanov, since they're historical fantasies, obviously I had to do a lot of research. And I researched kind of the big world types of things, and I did timelines to make sure that I was following the proper story. And then once I kind of understood the historical aspect of it is when I started writing. And with the Out of Time series, I did a lot of research for the future and nanotechnology because it was a futuristic story and I wanted to make sure that I could set up the world right. But usually I end up doing the minute descriptions like clothing and buildings and smells and all of that sort of stuff after in editing. So research wise, I just do as much research as is necessary for me to be able to start writing. And then I do all of the rest after I've already finished the first draft, because then I at least have a place to put the research and I know what I'm going to need to research to put into the story. Okay, writing by hand. So you may have noticed I've been holding this notebook a lot. I don't have a laptop. I have a little iPad, and this is what I travel with. And if I write on a computer or a Word document, I will be doing that using my iPad typically. I almost never ever write at my desktop computer. because that's where I do all of my work things, and I try to keep separate in my mind sitting down to do email versus sitting down to write. A lot of you know that I try to write my first drafts by hand. This is the notebook that I used for Fox. And I wrote the majority of Fox by hand. I do all of my research kind of in the front of the book, and I'm moving forward through the notebook as I take notes and research. So these are all notes on like timelines and time periods and things like that. But when I write the book, I start from the back of the notebook upside down, and then I write, oh, this one I didn't do it upside down. How weird of me. And then I write the entire book and just scenes like that all the way through until I feel like I'm ready to type it up onto my iPad or into a Word document. Why do I write by hand? First of all, I don't write every book by hand. I prefer writing by hand, but sometimes deadlines and contracts don't let me write by hand because it is much slower. But I write by hand for many, many reasons. Number one, I love the tangibility of paper and ink. We've always talked about paper and ink just as writers, but in reality, where it's like virtual paper and virtual ink. And I'm a bit nostalgic in feeling connected to kind of the art of writing that past authors have used, like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and although Tolkien wrote on a typewriter, but minutia. So I love the tangibility, I love the nostalgia, but also, and I believe this is true for most people, my brain works a lot differently when I am writing by hand than if I'm staring at a computer screen. So think about how you read books. I prefer physical books. I do not prefer ebooks. I don't comprehend them as well. And ebooks are on a screen. Physical books are paper and you hold them in your hands. So if I'm going to be creative and I'm writing a book, a story that is filled with imagination and creativity, if I'm writing it on a screen, that's similar to me as reading an ebook. There's a little bit of a disconnect. Words just don't come out clearer. It feels a bit too sterile for me. I like to write a book the way that I prefer to read books, because it makes sense that if my brain is preferring the physical contact of paper in my hands, and that inspires me as a reader, I get more inspired as a writer as well. Also, just the very posture of writing is different. When I'm writing on a screen, I'm upright and I'm staring forward and I'm typing. But when I'm writing in a book, it's like I'm entering into it. I know maybe this sounds kind of crazy, but the way my brain can enter into the story feels so much deeper and richer when I'm like looking down into this beautiful paper and writing with my hands. And I also have much, much better focus. When I am on a screen, even though my iPad, I always make sure that the Wi-Fi is turned off and it doesn't have any access to internet, I still get distracted. And when I'm writing in a notebook, I leave all of those things away. I will usually have my phone on me just so that I can be contacted by people, but it's either in a drawer or upside down, or sometimes I don't bring it with me. Sometimes I leave it out of the room so that I can just focus on writing and not have those distractions. Another thing is word count. When my goal is a word count, it changes the way I write. It's like I'm not writing the story for the story's sake. I'm writing it just to hit a word count, and then it comes out sloppier and I have to fix it anyway. When I'm writing by hand, I can't keep track of word count. I'm just focusing on, did I finish that scene? It's very freeing not to worry about how many words I wrote, and instead I'm writing the story and what it needs. And I'll talk later more about word count, but I'm not a word count goal type of person. I just try to write scenes that are in my head, and they'll be as long as they need to be. So lastly, writing by hand. I write with a fountain pen. Don't know if you can see. So I actually grew up writing with fountain pens. The school that I went to for kindergarten and first grade, and we wrote with fountain pens, and we focused on penmanship. And so I use a fountain pen because I actually get hand cramps less, because there is far less strain on your hand when you're writing with a fountain pen than when you're writing with another pen, especially like felt tipped pens that you have to hold like this, strains your hand differently. So holding a fountain pen, I don't get hand cramps, so I'm able to write for a much longer time. Okay, that's all of the writing by hand and all of the kind of how I set up to write and kind of how I approach writing Now to get to the actual drafting process of this story. I'm going to be sharing my drafting process kind of in chunks because I have to do it during Halfling's nap time, and his nap time is almost over, but I will at least let you know where I'm at with Wishtress. So I started actually putting words to paper maybe a month ago. And for me, I can't move forward with a story until I get the intro right. Sometimes the intro chapters come really, really quickly, like A Time to Die. When I wrote that, the first chapter that is currently in print in books that you hold in your hands is basically the same chapter that the same words that I wrote when I first wrote that chapter. It came out so clearly, and I knew exactly where I wanted to start, and everything that happened in that chapter was everything that I wanted it to be. Both Fox and Romanov, their intros took a lot more rewriting, but once I get it solidified, then I feel like I can charge through the rest of the story pretty easily. How long does it take me to write a draft? So I am a very slow writer. I'm also a slow reader. These are things I wish were different about myself, but they're not. Ideally, would love to be able to write a draft in less than 6 months. If I have a deadline and I'm under contract, I'll write it as fast as I have to write it. I had to write Romanov in 3 months from nothing to finished draft, and it was a very, very difficult job. Ideally would probably take me about 6 months to get a draft down that I'm pleased with. I do edit a little bit as I go, but only if there are plot holes. So when I'm writing by hand, I will write as much as I can until I feel like now I need to go back and change a lot in the beginning. Then I will go through and I will type up what I have handwritten and kind of fix the plot up until that point. And then I will go back to handwriting, and I'll just make a note in my notebook like, typed it up, and now starting afresh. With Wishtress, I currently have about 5,000 words down. I'm really, really happy with them. I will probably tune in again next Halfling's Nap and start sharing more about working on the plot and story world and characters and answering the questions that you guys had for that. I will be coming in with writing updates. I don't know how frequent they'll be because I don't know how long it's going to take me to finish this story, but that at least is kind of the foundation of when I'm sitting down to work on a story and my personal drafting process and where I'm at right now with this story. If after watching this you have any other questions, feel free to leave those down below, and feel free to ask any of those questions and I will add them to my list of questions that I will hopefully address in future drafting writing process videos. Alrighty, happy writing!